I could actually think my own thoughts. Hearst didn't just accept her captors' subjective beliefs, such as ideology. She bought into their views about how the physical world works. One of her captors didn't want me thinking about rescue because he thought that brain waves could be read or that, they'd get a psychic in to find me. And I was even afraid of that. Hearst's condition of coerced credulity is called the Stockholm Syndrome, after a kidnapping in Sweden. But the term syndrome may be misleading in its suggestion of abnormality. Hearst's response to her circumstances was probably an example of human nature functioning properly. We seem to be designed by natural selection to be brainwashed. Some people find this prospect a shocking affront to human autonomy, but they tend not to be evolutionary psychologists. In Darwinian terms, it makes sense that our species could contain genes encouraging a blind credulity in at least some situations. If you are surrounded by a small group of people on whom your survival depends, rejecting the beliefs that are most important to them will not help you live long enough to get your genes into the next generation. Confinement with a small group of people may sound so rare that natural selection would have little chance to take account of it, but it is in a sense the natural human condition. Humans evolved in small groups, 20, 40, 60 people, from which emigration was often not a viable option. Survival depended on social support, sharing food, sticking together during fights, and so on. To alienate your peers by stubbornly contesting their heartfelt beliefs would have lowered your chances of genetic proliferation. Maybe that explains why you don't have to lock somebody in a closet to get a bit of the Stockholm Syndrome. Religious cults just offer aimless teenagers a free bus ride to a free meal, and after the recruits have been surrounded by believers for a few days, they tend to warm up to the beliefs. And there doesn't have to be some powerful authority figure pushing the beliefs. In one famous social psychology experiment, subjects opined that two lines of manifestly different lengths were the same length, once a few of their peers, who were in fact Confederates, voiced that opinion. Given this conformist bias in human nature, it's not surprising that people born into primitive religions, or any other religions, accept an elaborate belief system that outside observers might find highly dubious. But the question remains, how did the elaborate belief system ever come into existence? Granted that people are inclined to accept their community's official edifice of belief and ritual, especially if no alternatives are on offer, but how did the edifice come to exist in the first place? How did religion get built from the ground up? God bites man. To answer this question, we have to view cultural evolution at a fine-grained level. We have to think about individual units of culture, beliefs and practices in this case, and how they spread. The biologist Richard Dawkins coined the term meme for units of culture in part because it sounds a bit like gene, and he wanted to stress some parallels between cultural and biological evolution. For example, just as genes are transmitted from body to body down the generations, memes are transmitted from mind to mind. And just as newly minted genes compete for a place in the gene pool, newly minted memes compete for the finite space in the world's supply of human brains. In this constant struggle of meme against meme, what kinds of memes will have a selective advantage? Newspapers are a good place to look for clues. Newspaper editors work hard to figure out what kinds of information people want and to fill that demand. They are accomplished meme engineers, and thus students of human nature. One thing you'll notice about newspapers is that they have a bias toward good things and bad things. The headlines, "Stock market rises by 5%, and "Stock market drops by 5%, will get better play than the headline, "Stock market does nothing in particular." Here religions, and certainly primitive religions, are like newspapers. In every hunter-gatherer society, religion is devoted largely to explaining why bad things happen and why good things happen. Illness, recovery, famine, abundance, and so on. There is also devotion to raising the ratio of good to bad. The Andaman Islanders, convinced that whistling at night attracts bad spirits, whereas singing repels them, do more singing in the dark than whistling in the dark. People naturally try to exert control over their environment, and believing that they have such control naturally makes them feel good. So people's minds are open to ideas that promise to give them such control. This doesn't mean people uncritically embrace every such idea that comes their way, but it does mean that these ideas get their attention. And for a meme, that's the first step toward acceptance. While the Andaman Island meme asserting that thunderstorms are divine punishment for melting beeswax was hardly guaranteed a place in the society's religion, it had a big head start over memes saying, "Thunderstorms just happen. There's nothing you can do about it." Another thing you'll notice in newspapers is that the strange and novel wins out over the ordinary and expected. Tuberculosis and the recently discovered West Nile virus are both bad news, and in terms of the number of people killed, tuberculosis is the worst of the two. Yet the headline, "Outbreak of Deadly New Virus Puzzles Experts," easily crowds out, "Usual number of people expected to die of tuberculosis this year." Except perhaps in the humor magazine The Onion, which earns its laughs by violating this pattern. As journalism sages famously put it, "Dog bites man is not a story. Man bites dog is a story." It makes sense that human brains would naturally seize on strange, surprising things, since the predictable things have already been absorbed into the expectations that guide them through the world. News of the strange and surprising may signal that some amendment of our expectations is warranted. But one property of strange, surprising claims is that they're often untrue. So if they get preferred access to our brains, that gives falsehood a kind of advantage, if a fleeting advantage, over truth. In the days after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, one widely circulated story was that a man at the top of one of the Twin Towers had survived by sliding down the rubble as it formed. It was a story so incredible that it virtually compelled you to click the forward icon on your email, and a story so incredible that it wasn't true. It was an example of the famous dictum that a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its boots on. Of course, in the long run, the truth often does get its boots on, and people often welcome it upon its arrival. Indeed, if the attraction to surprising news weren't balanced by an attraction to claims that survive subsequent scrutiny, the average human ancestor wouldn't have lived long enough to become a human ancestor. Imagine a local sage, 200,000 years ago, saying that eating a certain berry will let you live forever. Now imagine that the first two people who follow his advice drop dead. Genes that counseled continued faith in advice thus besieged by countervailing evidence would not long remain a part of the species, whereas genes that inclined the brain to take account of such evidence might. This natural human respect for evidence is the reason convincing someone that 1 + 1 = 3, or that water flows uphill, takes real work. But some kinds of beliefs are harder to test than those two, and hard-to-test beliefs could do well in the process of cultural evolution that gave birth to religion. Indeed, hunter-gatherer religious belief, like religious belief generally, consists largely of claims that resist falsification. The Haida, a people indigenous to the northwest coast of North America, when caught in a storm while out at sea, would try to appease the relevant authorities, killer whale deities, by pouring a cup of fresh water into the sea or putting some tobacco or deer tallow on the end of a paddle. Many people no doubt returned from sea to report that these measures had kept them from drowning. No one presumably ever reported that they had taken these measures but drowned anyway.